I've been hiking the Blue Ridge for most of my adult life. That's not an exaggeration. My father took me up my first trail when I was 7 years old. A modest ridge walk in the southern section, nothing technical, just enough elevation to see the valley spread out below us, like a quilt someone had dropped from a great height. I was hooked from that first overlook. Something about the mountains settled into me in a way that nothing else ever has. The scale of them, the indifference of them, the way they make your problems feel exactly as small as they actually are. By the time I was in my 30s, I had hiked most of the accessible Blue Ridge trail systems at least twice. I knew the seasonal changes, how the trail looked in early April, when the redbuds came in, how it smelled in July after an afternoon storm, how the light moved through the canopy in October, when the leaves had thinned enough to let the low autumn sun cut through at angles. I knew which sections flooded in spring and which ones dried out by August. I knew where the reliable water sources were and which ones ran brown after heavy rain. I knew the sounds. That's the part I want you to understand before anything else. I knew what those woods sounded like, and I knew the difference between sounds that belonged there and sounds that didn't. I started that particular hike on a Thursday morning in late September. The weather was ideal, mid-50s at the trailhead, a light overcast that would keep the heat down, no rain in the forecast for at least 3 days. I signed the register at the trailhead box, the same one I'd signed a dozen times before, and started up the familiar switchback that led to the main ridgeline trail. My plan was simple: follow the main ridge north for about 8 miles, drop down to the creek crossing at mile marker 6, refill my water, and loop back on the lower trail to the parking area. A day hike I'd done in variations, probably 6 or 7 times, nothing ambitious, nothing technical, just a long, quiet day in the mountains. The first 2 hours were exactly what I needed them to be. The overcast held, the temperature stayed comfortable, and the trail was empty enough that I went long stretches without hearing anything but my own footsteps and the occasional bird moving through the canopy above me. There's a section of that trail, just past mile marker 3, where the ridge narrows and you can see down both sides into the valleys below, and I always stop there for a few minutes. I stopped that day too, ate half a granola bar, drank some water, and stood there looking out at the mountains, rolling away to the west, until the cold started to creep through my jacket. Then, I kept moving. I was somewhere between mile marker 4 and 5 when I saw the path. It was on the left side of the trail, cutting into the trees at a slight downward angle, narrow maybe 2 feet across, but clearly defined. The ground had been worn down in a way that suggested regular use. The edges were distinct. This wasn't a game trail or a drainage channel or a place where hikers had stepped off to take a view. It was a path, a deliberate, maintained path that branched off the main trail and disappeared into the trees. I stopped and looked at it for a moment. I pulled out my topo map and checked it against my position. No secondary trail marked in that section. I checked the trail map I downloaded before the hike. Nothing. I looked up and down the main trail in both directions. Empty. I looked back at the path. It was right there, obvious and worn and real, heading down through the trees in a direction I couldn't see the end of. I've read enough incident reports to know that you don't follow unmarked trails alone without telling someone. I know that rule. I've followed it my entire hiking life. But standing there looking at that path, something in me that I can't fully explain decided that it was probably just a shortcut used by locals, maybe a property access trail that predated the park boundaries, or a hunter's route that had been worn in over decades. The Blue Ridge is full of old trails that don't make it onto official maps. I told myself that. I told myself I'd just take a quick look, see where it went, turn back at the first sign it was heading somewhere uninhabited and unmaintained. I followed it for maybe a quarter mile. That's my best estimate. It's hard to judge distance on a trail like that, narrow, slightly downhill, winding enough that you can't see far ahead. The trees on either side were older than the ones near the main trail, larger and more densely spaced, and after the first few hundred feet, the canopy overhead thickened considerably. The light changed. That's the first thing that actually registered as wrong. It was only mid-afternoon, but the light filtering through the canopy had taken on that quality you usually only see in the hour before dusk, dim and directionless, with no clear source. The second thing was the quiet. I've mentioned that I know what those woods sound like. What I mean by that specifically is that a healthy Appalachian forest in late September is not quiet. There are always sounds, the percussion of woodpeckers somewhere up the ridge, the movement of small animals through the leaf litter, the occasional traffic of birds shifting between trees. Wind in the upper canopy has a specific sound, a low and layered hiss that you stop consciously hearing after a while, but that you notice immediately when it stops. It had stopped, all of it. The birds, the wind, the subtle ambient noise of the forest. I was standing in a silence that was not natural. Not the silence of winter, not the silence of a cold snap that had pushed everything underground. A held silence, the kind of silence that feels less like absence and more like attention. I stopped walking. I stood still and listened for a full minute. Nothing. The forest around me was absolutely, completely silent. That was when I decided to turn back. I turned around on the path and took maybe 3 steps back toward the main trail before I saw the figure. It was standing at the far end of the path in the direction I'd come from, back toward where the trail connected to the main route. I could see it clearly enough despite the poor light. It was the shape of a person, standing perfectly still in the center of the narrow path, framed on both sides by the dark tree trunks, at a distance I estimated at somewhere between 50 and 80 yards. Too far to see the face. Far enough that the details were soft. But I could see it. It was standing there watching me. I did not move for what felt like a very long time. I stood on that path and looked at the figure, and the figure stood and looked back at me, and neither of us moved. I kept waiting for it to shift, to call out, to do something that would explain it. A hiker who'd followed the same path out of the same curiosity I had, a ranger checking the area, a hunter who'd come up from the valley. Any of those things would have made sense. None of those things happened. It just stood there, still in a way that people aren't still when they're simply pausing. There was no weight shifting, no adjustment of footing, no movement of the arms, just that absolute patient stillness. And then I noticed the arms. Even at that distance, even in that dim and sourceless light, I could see that the arms were wrong. They hung too far down, below the hip, past where arms are supposed to end. I told myself it was a trick of distance, of light, of my own fear rewriting what I was seeing into something worse than it was. I told myself that. I want to be honest about the fact that I told myself that very deliberately, the way you tell yourself something when part of you already knows it isn't true. I backed away. I kept my eyes on the figure, and I backed away from it slowly, moving down the path in the direction it had gone, which was the wrong direction, away from the main trail, further into whatever this path led to. I know that wasn't logical, but moving toward it was not something my body would allow. I backed away until the path curved enough that it passed out of my direct line of sight, and then I turned and I ran. I don't remember the specific details of what came next. I remember brush hitting my arms and face. I remember the grade of the ground changing as I found my way back up toward the ridgeline. I remember breaking out onto the main trail and turning south and running without slowing down for longer than I have run continuously in years. I remember the parking area appearing around a bend, and my car sitting there where I'd left it, and the feeling of getting the door open and locking it, and sitting in the driver's seat with my hands shaking on my thighs, unable to make myself put the key in the ignition for a long time. I sat in that car for 20 minutes, maybe longer. I watched the trailhead in my rearview mirror until I couldn't stand looking at it anymore, and then I drove. I went back the next morning. Not to hike, I drove to the ranger station on the south end of the parkway and asked to speak to someone. A ranger came out, older man, the kind who's been in those mountains long enough to have the look of them in his face. I described what had happened. The path, the location, the figure. I described the arms. He listened to all of it without interrupting me. He didn't write anything down. He asked a few clarifying questions about location, which mile marker, which side of the trail, and when I confirmed the details, his expression shifted in a way I couldn't quite read. Not surprise, exactly. Something more like recognition. He told me that section of trail had been closed. Not formally, not with signage I would have seen on the main route, but internally flagged in their system for 3 years. He said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd mention a maintenance issue or a seasonal closure. I asked him why it had been closed. He was quiet for a moment. Not a long moment, just long enough to suggest he was choosing his words with some care. People keep wandering off it, he said. I waited for more. There wasn't more. He thanked me for coming in, told me to stick to the marked trails, and went back inside the station. I sat in my car in the ranger station parking lot for a while before I drove home. I've thought about that answer many times since. People keep wandering off it. Not people keep getting lost. Not people keep leaving the trail. Wandering. The specific word for the specific thing that I had done followed a path I had no reason to follow, for no reason I could adequately explain afterward, to a place that was not on any map and not meant to be found. I've thought about what that ranger knew that he didn't say. I've thought about how long those other people wandered before they found their way back, or whether they did. I still hike the Blue Ridge. I want to be clear about that. I'm not someone who lets fear take something I love away from me, and those mountains are as much a part of my life as anything else in it. But I stay on the marked trails now. I stay on them in a way I didn't before, not out of habit or casual compliance, but out of a considered and specific decision every single time I'm out there. And I don't stop to look at unmarked paths, no matter how worn they are, no matter how certain I am that they're probably nothing. I have always been the kind of person who needs to plan things in order to enjoy them. That's not a flaw I'm apologizing for, it's just how I'm built. When I decide to do something, I research it, I prepare for it, I think through the variables until I feel confident in what I'm walking into. So when I say I planned that overnight trip for weeks, I mean I actually planned it. I checked weather patterns going back 3 years for that time of September. I cross-referenced 3 different trail maps against recent hiker reports. I made a gear list and checked it twice, packed and repacked my bag until the weight distribution felt right, and told 2 people, my sister and a friend from work, exactly where I was going, which trail I was starting from, and what time they should expect to hear from me when I came out the other side. I want to establish that because I need you to understand that what happened that night was not the result of carelessness. It was not the result of poor planning or bad judgment or any of the things people assume when they hear a story like this. I did everything right. I was prepared, I was experienced, and I chose a section of trail that I had hiked twice before in daylight and felt completely comfortable with. None of that made any difference. The section of Blue Ridge I'd chosen was one of the quieter ones, not accessible from any of the popular parkway pull-offs, not listed in any of the mainstream hiking guides, not the kind of place that got weekend traffic from casual tourists with day packs and new boots. You had to know it was there, and you had to want to go. The trailhead was a gravel pull-off on a Forest Service road about 4 miles off the main route, and the trail itself was a 9-mile loop that climbed a modest ridge before dropping into a long, sheltered hollow and looping back through a dry creek drainage. I'd done the full loop in a day before. This time I wanted to spend a night in the hollow, cook a real meal, wake up with the mountain, and take the back half of the loop out in the morning. I started at noon, which gave me plenty of time to reach the hollow before dark, even with a comfortable pace. The hike in was everything I'd hoped it would be. The September light was long and gold. The air was cool enough to make the climbing comfortable, and the trail was empty from start to finish. I passed one other person, a man coming out as I was going in, day pack, moving quickly, who nodded and kept walking without stopping, and after that I had the trail entirely to myself. I reached the hollow at about 5:30 in the afternoon, with nearly an hour of good light left. The hollow was exactly as I remembered it, a long, gradual depression between 2 low ridges, the dry creek bed running along the eastern edge, the ground mostly flat and covered in a thick layer of old leaves. There was a natural clearing near the bend in the creek bed, where the trees thinned out enough to make a comfortable camp, maybe 40 feet across, sheltered on the north side by the ridge, open to the south. Good drainage, good sight lines. I'd noted it on my previous hike as a good overnight spot, and I'd been right. I came into the clearing and stopped. It took me a few seconds to process what I was seeing because my brain initially did what brains do and tried to explain it before I'd fully looked at it. Someone had been here. That was the first clear thought. The second thought, arriving almost immediately behind it, was that they had been here recently. The fire ring was the first thing I really focused on. It was a proper ring stones arranged in a deliberate circle about 2 feet across, not a casual scatter, but something someone had put effort into building. That alone would have told me people used this clearing for camping, which I already knew. What told me more was the ash. I crouched down and held my hand a few inches above the center of the ring. There was warmth coming up from it, not heat. Not the warmth of a fire that had been burning an hour ago, but the faint, fading warmth of ash that had not yet fully cooled, which meant the fire had burned sometime in the past several hours. That morning, maybe. Or the night before, at the latest. I stood up and looked around the clearing more carefully. Against the base of a large oak on the western edge, someone had folded and leaned a camp chair. It was old. The aluminum frame was spotted with rust, and the fabric seat was weathered and stained in ways that suggested years of outdoor exposure. It had not been left here accidentally. It was folded neatly, deliberately stored against the tree, the way you'd set something aside for later rather than abandon it. And then there was the boot. It was sitting in the approximate center of the clearing, upright, facing outward toward the trail I'd come in on. A single work boot, heavy, leather, well-worn, the kind of boot made for serious outdoor use. Laced, upright, placed, not dropped. Set there with the same deliberateness as the folded chair, the same intentionality that distinguished it from something simply forgotten. I stood in the middle of that clearing for a while and thought about it. I walked the perimeter slowly, looking for anything else I might have missed. There was nothing, no second boot, no pack, no food scraps, no other sign of occupation beyond those three things. I checked the soft ground near the creek bed for footprints. The soil there was dry but fine enough to hold impressions, and there were some partial, overlapping, not clear enough to read much from, but present. Someone had been here. Someone had been here today, or last night, had built a fire, had sat in that chair, and had apparently left without their boot. I told myself the story that made sense. A solo camper who'd been here the night before, left in the morning, left the chair because it was old and heavy and not worth carrying, and left the boot because people leave strange things in the woods sometimes. Because maybe it was already worn out. Because maybe there was a perfectly ordinary explanation that would be obvious to anyone who'd been here and wasn't obvious to me because I was only seeing the aftermath. I almost left. I want to be honest about that. Something in the arrangement of those objects made me want to pick up my pack and walk back out the way I'd come. Not fear exactly. I couldn't have told you what I was afraid of. More like the feeling of walking into a room and sensing that you've interrupted something, even when the room appears empty. But the light was failing, and I had 8 miles to cover the next day, and there was no other logical stopping point between here and the trailhead. And I had planned this trip, and I was not the kind of person who abandoned plans because of a boot and a camp chair and an uneasiness I couldn't name. I set up my tent on the far side of the clearing from the fire ring, with the door facing south, away from the tree line. I cooked my dinner, ate it quickly, and was inside my tent with the zipper closed before it was fully dark. I read for a while by headlamp, listened to the hollow settle into its nighttime sounds, the creak and knock of branches, the distant movement of something small through the leaves, and told myself I was fine. I was tired from the hike. I fell asleep faster than I expected to. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. My watch was in my pack outside, and I hadn't thought to bring it into the tent. It was dark, fully dark, no moonlight reaching through the tent fabric, the deep dark of a cloudy mountain night. I was awake, and I didn't know why, and then I heard it, and I understood why. Footsteps. Not near, maybe 20 feet from the tent when I first became aware of them, but moving slowly around the perimeter of the clearing in a wide circle that kept a consistent distance from the tent. I lay on my back in my sleeping bag and I listened, and I did not move. The steps were measured, one at a time, evenly spaced, with just enough pause between each one to make them sound deliberate. Not the movement of an animal foraging through the leaves. I have heard that sound many times and I know it. Animals move in bursts and pauses. Animals double back. Animals make incidental sound, the swish of a tail, the snap of a stick taken at an angle. This was different. This was a rhythm, a slow, patient, entirely purposeful rhythm circling my tent in the dark. I counted the steps. I don't know why, it was something to do with my mind while my body lay rigid and still and my breathing went shallow. I counted the steps and I tracked the sound as it moved from the south side of the tent around to the west and then to the north and then to the east and then back to the south, making a full loop. One complete, slow, even circuit around the tent. And then they stopped. Directly behind my head. On the north side of the tent, the side that faced the ridge, the side with no door. The silence that followed was total. No movement, no retreating footsteps, no sound at all from outside the tent. Just the sudden and absolute absence of the sound that had been there a moment before, replaced by a silence that felt occupied rather than empty. And then I heard something being set down. Just outside the tent door on the south side, not where the footsteps had stopped, but at the front, which meant something had moved from the back of the tent to the front in complete silence while I'd been lying there listening for it. A soft, deliberate sound. Something placed carefully on the ground. I did not sleep again that night. I lay in my sleeping bag with my knife in my hand and I waited for the light to come. I did not hear the footsteps again. I did not hear any movement outside the tent. The hours between that sound and dawn were the longest I have ever spent. Lying still in the dark with my heart pushing so hard I could feel it in my ears, telling myself over and over that there was a reasonable explanation, knowing somewhere underneath that telling myself something and believing it are not the same thing. When the light finally came, that first gray pre-dawn light that's more a lessening of dark than an actual illumination, I unzipped the tent door. The other boot was sitting next to my pack, matching the one that had been in the center of the clearing, which was now gone from where I'd seen it the night before. This one was placed the same way upright, facing out, laced, neatly set beside my gear as if it had always belonged there. And in the dirt in front of the tent door, written in letters about 4 inches tall, was my name. My full first name, spelled correctly, in the soft earth, directly in front of the opening where I would have stepped if I'd come out in the night. I stared at it for a long time. I looked at the tree line. I looked at the ridge. I looked at the camp chair, which was still folded against the oak where it had been the night before. I looked at the fire ring, where the ash was cold now. I packed everything without eating breakfast. I didn't filter water at the creek. I didn't sit down once between the clearing and the trailhead. I hiked the remaining 8 miles in just over 3 hours and I didn't look back. My sister called that afternoon to check on me. I told her the hike was fine. I told her I was home safe. I didn't tell her the rest of it. Not then. I've told very few people the rest of it. What I keep coming back to, what I have never been able to let go of, is not the footsteps, and not the boot, and not even my name written in the dirt. It's the fact that someone knew my name. I was alone in a hollow, 9 miles from the nearest trailhead, in a section of trail that doesn't appear in any mainstream guide, on a trip I'd told 2 people about, and someone in the dark outside my tent knew what to write in the dirt. I have not hiked alone since that night. I don't say that as a conclusion or a moral or a lesson. I say it as a fact about who I became after sleeping or not sleeping in that clearing. Some things change you in ways that don't change back, and the dark of that hollow, and the sound of those measured footsteps, and my name waiting for me in the morning dirt are among them. There is a particular kind of fear that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive with a sound or a sight or a moment you can point to and say, that's when I knew. It builds the way weather builds slowly, through accumulation, through small changes in pressure that you don't consciously register until you look up and realize the sky has gone the wrong color and you don't remember when that happened. That's the kind of fear I'm talking about when I tell you about the man on the trail. There was no single moment when everything changed. There was just a morning that started ordinary and kept adding things, one at a time, until ordinary was so far behind me, I couldn't see it anymore. I had taken that particular loop maybe 4 times over the years. It was a moderate trail in the southern Blue Ridge, not a beginner route, but nothing that required any technical skill. About 11 miles total, with a steady climb in the first third, a long ridgeline walk through open forest in the middle section, and a gradual descent back to the trailhead through a mixed hardwood hollow. The kind of trail that rewards you with good views without making you earn them too painfully. I liked it because it was long enough to feel like a real day out, but not so demanding that I had to be precious about preparation. I'd go on a weekday when the lot was mostly empty, sign in at the register, and have the better part of the trail to myself. That Tuesday in early October was no different in the beginning. I parked at 7:15, the lot holding only 2 other cars, both of which looked like they'd been there since the previous evening, a beat-up pickup that I recognized as belonging to a regular I'd seen a few times before, and a small sedan with a camping permit on the dash. I signed the register, adjusted my pack, and started up the first switchback as the morning light was just beginning to come over the eastern ridge. The first 2 hours were good. The air was cold enough that I could see my breath for the first 40 minutes, and the trail was empty and quiet in the way that October trails are quiet, the summer birds mostly gone, the leaves past their peak color and beginning to thin, the whole forest in that process of pulling inward that happens before winter. I reached the ridgeline at about the 2-hour mark and stopped at a rocky outcrop that I always stopped at a small shelf of exposed granite that jutted out from the tree line and offered a long view south across the valley. I ate some food, drank water, checked my map out of habit rather than necessity. I knew where I was. I knew where I was going. I looked back down the trail the way I'd come, the way you do when you're standing at a high point and the view runs in both directions. That's when I saw him. He was about 100 yards back down the trail, far enough that I couldn't read his face, close enough that I could see him clearly. Middle-aged, I thought, or somewhere in that broad range between 40 and 60 that's hard to narrow from a distance. Plain jacket, dark-colored, the kind with a zipper that could have come from any department store. No pack, no trekking poles, no water bottle that I could see. He was just walking, hands in his pockets, at an easy pace, looking at the trail in front of him with no particular expression that I could make out. I registered him, and then I looked back at the view south and finished my food. Nothing about what I'd seen required any particular attention. People hike without packs all the time on day routes. People hike in plain jackets. There was nothing unusual about a man on a trail, and I didn't give him more than a few seconds of thought before I packed up my map and kept moving north along the ridgeline. About 20 minutes later, I stopped to check my water and adjust a strap on my pack that had been sitting slightly wrong and making my left shoulder ache. A routine stop, 30 seconds at most. I didn't think about the man behind me. I was thinking about my shoulder strap. And then I started moving again. And after another few steps, I glanced back. Not for any reason. Just the instinct you develop on a long ridgeline where you can see a good distance behind you, and he was there. Same distance, about 100 yards back. I looked at him for a moment. He was walking, not looking at me, just moving along the trail at that same easy pace. I turned back around and kept going. I told myself it was nothing. The trail was 11 miles. People covered ground at different speeds, and sometimes those speeds aligned and you ended up hiking in loose proximity to a stranger for a stretch. It happened all the time. I'd done it myself on busy trail days, fallen into an unintentional rhythm with someone ahead of me without meaning to. But I was already thinking about it. That's the honest truth. I was already thinking about it in the back of my mind in a way I hadn't been 10 minutes earlier. I picked up my pace. Not dramatically. I didn't want to look like I was reacting to anything, and I also wasn't sure I was reacting to anything. I just lengthened my stride a little, the way you do when you're trying to make up time on a long day. I held that pace for about 15 minutes, and then stopped at a spot where the trail crossed a short rocky section, and I had a natural excuse to pause and look at my footing. He was 100 yards back, not closer, not farther, the same distance, which meant he had also increased his pace over those 15 minutes by exactly enough to maintain the gap. I stood on that rocky section for a moment and thought about the arithmetic of that. The trail behind me was straight and open for a good distance. I had been walking faster than I had been before. He had kept pace with me precisely enough that the distance between us hadn't changed at all. And he was still walking with his hands in his pockets, still looking at the trail, still making no sign that he was aware of me or working to keep up. I tried the oldest trick. There was a wide spot in the trail just ahead where the path curved around a large fallen tree, and I stepped off into the space beside the log and made a show of checking my map, watching the trail back the way I'd come. Come on, I thought. Come past me. Walk past me and keep going and be a normal hiker who just happens to move at my pace, and this will all be nothing. He stopped. Not where I could see him. He'd been around the last curve when I stepped off the trail, so I couldn't see him directly. But I could hear the footsteps, and they stopped, and they stayed stopped. I waited for a full 2 minutes, standing beside that fallen tree with my map open and my eyes on the bend in the trail. Nothing. No footsteps. No appearance around the curve. Just silence. I got back on the trail. I started walking, and within about 30 seconds I heard the footsteps resume behind me. The next 4 miles were the longest of my hiking life. I know that sounds like an exaggeration. I'm not exaggerating. Every step of those 4 miles was taken with the awareness of that figure behind me, always at distance, always at the same distance, always matching my pace with that infuriating, patient precision. I tried varying my speed twice more, slowing to almost a stop and then pushing as fast as I could sustain. The distance didn't change. 100 yards, always 100 yards. My phone had 1 bar of signal at a high point on the trail about 3 miles from the trailhead. I stopped and tried to call a friend, someone I checked in with on solo hikes, someone who would know what to make of this and what to tell me to do. The call connected, rang once, and dropped. I tried again. It didn't connect at all the second time. I sent a text that I didn't know would go through and kept moving. I didn't want to show fear. That was the thought I kept coming back to, and I'm not sure now whether it was wisdom or pride or some unhelpful combination of both. Showing fear felt like it would change something, though I couldn't have told you what. So I kept my pace, and I kept my posture, and when I finally decided I couldn't keep pretending not to know he was there, I stopped and turned around and waited for him to close the distance. He kept walking toward me at the same easy pace and stopped about 10 feet away. Up close, he was ordinary in every way I could assess. Medium height, medium build, a face I wouldn't have been able to pick out of a group without concentration. Clean, not sweating despite the pace and the mileage. He looked at me with an expression I can only describe as patient, not friendly, not unfriendly, just waiting for whatever this was going to be. I asked him if he needed help. I kept my voice even. I was proud of that in the moment. He smiled. It was a wide smile, unhurried, like he'd been expecting the question and found it mildly amusing. He said he was just enjoying the walk. That was the exact phrase, just enjoying the walk. Then he stood there and waited, still smiling, in no apparent hurry to continue past me or to go back or to do anything at all except stand there being exactly as present as he'd been for the past 6 miles. I nodded and turned back around and started walking. I heard him start walking behind me approximately 3 seconds later. There was nothing overtly threatening about any of it. No weapon, no raised voice, no aggressive movement or explicit menace. If I tried to explain to someone who hadn't been there why I was afraid, the facts of it don't sound like much a man walking behind me, keeping pace, smiling when I spoke to him. People would say I was paranoid. Maybe they'd be right. But fear isn't always about what someone does. Sometimes it's about the quality of a presence. The particular flavor of attention that a person can radiate without saying or doing anything you can point to. And what radiated off that man for 6 miles of mountain trail was something I have never been able to name but have never forgotten. I reached the parking lot with him, still behind me. I got to my car, got the key in the door, got inside, and locked it before I'd fully sat down. I watched the trailhead in the mirror. He emerged about 3 minutes after me, walked to the edge of the lot, and stood at the boundary where the gravel met the tree line, not coming toward my car, not doing anything, just standing there watching it. I reversed out and drove to the exit without looking away from the mirror, and his eyes followed the car the entire way. I drove 2 towns over before I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there until my hands stopped shaking enough to use my phone. I called the non-emergency line for the county sheriff's office and reported what had happened. They were patient with me, asked the questions you'd expect, took down a description. They called me back 2 days later. The officer I spoke to said they had checked the trail register for that day and found no record of anyone matching the description I'd given registering to hike that trail. The 2 cars in the lot when I'd arrived, they'd run the plates. Both were accounted for. Neither matched anything concerning. There was simply no record of that man having been on that trail at all. I've hiked that trail once since then. I went with 2 other people, on a weekend, in a group that never spread out enough that anyone was alone. I didn't enjoy it the way I used to. I kept checking behind us. I kept doing the math on distance and pace in the back of my mind. The way you keep doing a calculation you already know the answer to. I haven't gone back alone. I don't think I'm going to. I want to be upfront about something before I tell you this, because I've told it to a few people over the years, and the response I usually get is some version of a rationalization. Oh, it was probably just hikers. Probably just decorations. Probably just an old woman out for a walk. And maybe that's true. Maybe everything I saw that day has an explanation that would make me feel foolish for the way it affected me. I'm open to that possibility. But I've been hiking remote backcountry trails alone for 15 years, And in that time, I have developed a certain confidence in my own ability to read a situation, to distinguish between things that are strange and things that are actually wrong. What I found on that ridgeline trail in late October was not strange. It was wrong. And the difference between those two things is something I feel in my body rather than my head, and my body has not been wrong about it yet. I had driven up to the northern Blue Ridge on a Tuesday, specifically because I wanted the trail to myself. October weekends on the popular sections of the parkway are crowded in a way that defeats the purpose of being out there. But a Tuesday in the middle of the month, on a trail that wasn't listed in any of the major guides, was about as close to guaranteed solitude as you could get. The trail I'd chosen was a ridgeline route about 12 miles out and back, with the first and last sections running through dense hardwood forest before opening up onto a long exposed ridge in the middle. I'd found it through an older trail guide I'd picked up at a used bookstore, the kind printed before trail apps existed, and I'd been meaning to hike it for 2 seasons. I started just after 7 in the morning. The parking area was a wide gravel shoulder on a Forest Service road, no official signage, no register box, just a faint trail opening in the tree line and a blaze mark on a nearby trunk that had been there long enough to be half absorbed by the bark. The morning was cold and overcast, the sky a flat, uniform gray that gave the light an even, shadowless quality I've always liked for hiking. No glare, no heat, everything visible in equal measure. I layered up and headed in. The first 3 miles were unremarkable in the best possible way. The trail climbed steadily through mature hardwood forest, the leaves mostly down and gathered in deep drifts on either side of the path, the bare canopy overhead, letting in enough of that gray sky to keep things well lit. I could see a good distance into the trees in all directions. The forest was open and airy in the way that October forests are all the summer undergrowth dead back, the visibility that had been 10 feet in July now extending 60 or 80 feet through the bare trunks. I felt good. I felt that particular ease that comes from being alone in the woods on a weekday when the rest of the world is somewhere doing something else. The first one was easy to miss. I almost did miss it. It was hanging from a low branch on the left side of the trail, about 4 miles in a small bundle of sticks, maybe 6 inches long, tied together with dark cord in a rough cross shape, the kind of thing you could walk past 100 times and never register. I noticed it because a slight movement caught my eye, the bundle swaying almost imperceptibly in air that I couldn't feel moving. I looked at it for a moment. Trail marker, I thought. Some hikers used natural materials to mark routes or waypoints, and it wasn't unusual to find handmade markers on unmaintained trails. I kept walking. 50 yards further, there were 2 more. These were on opposite sides of the trail, hung at roughly the same height, made from the same kind of dark cord, still small, still simple, still easy to explain. But I noticed them in a way I hadn't noticed the first one, with a slightly different quality of attention. Another 100 yards, and they were on both sides of the trail continuously, not clustered, but spaced. Every 20 or 30 feet, alternating sides, bundles of sticks, strips of dark fabric knotted around branches, small gatherings of dried plant material tied into rough shapes I didn't have names for. None of it was large. None of it was immediately alarming. But the consistency of it, the regularity of the spacing, the way it lined the trail on both sides, like something marking a boundary or a passage, that was when my attention shifted from casual to careful. I kept walking because the alternative was turning around and covering the same 4 miles I'd just come through, and I told myself I was being irrational. Folk art, I thought. Trail decoration. Somebody's project. People did strange things in remote places for reasons that made sense to them and would make sense to me if I knew the context. The Blue Ridge was full of old traditions and older beliefs, and what looked strange to an outsider often had roots going back generations. I was an outsider here. I reminded myself of that and kept moving. By mile 5, the objects had grown larger, and the arrangement had become more deliberate. What had been single bundles were now grouped constructions, several sticks bound together in shapes that suggested forms without being explicit about them, hung alongside strips of material that I was now close enough to identify as cloth, old cloth, faded and weathered in ways that suggested it had been out here through at least one full cycle of seasons. Some of the branches directly over the trail had multiple objects hanging from them, swaying gently in a wind I still couldn't feel at ground level. The trail was narrow enough that I was walking directly beneath some of them. Mile 6 was different in degree rather than kind, but the degree was enough to stop me in my tracks. The trees on both sides of the trail for the next half-mile were draped with what I can only describe as installations. Entire lower branches covered in hanging objects, bundles of what were clearly animal bones. Small ones, bird or rodent, stripped clean and dry, tied together with cord, and hung alongside clusters of dried herbs and grasses that I didn't recognize. The shapes bound together from sticks had grown more complex, suggesting human forms in the loose, abstract way that a scarecrow suggests a human form without committing to it. The cord used throughout was the same dark material, and up close I could see it wasn't store-bought twine but something hand-twisted, irregular in thickness, the kind of cord someone had made rather than purchased. The smell hit me at the same time the visual did. It was sharp and medicinal, and deeply organic dried herbs, and something underneath them that was darker and more animal. The smell of things that had been outside through heat and rain and cold. Not a rotting smell, an old smell. A smell that belonged to processes I didn't understand and wasn't sure I wanted to. I stood at the edge of it and looked down the trail. The half-mile stretch ran directly through the center of whatever this was. The trees on both sides laden with hanging objects, the path between them feeling suddenly like a corridor rather than a trail. I thought about turning around. I genuinely considered it, standing there at the beginning of that corridor with my heart doing something in my chest that it hadn't been doing 20 minutes earlier. But turning around meant covering the same half-mile in reverse, and something about doing that, moving back through it the wrong way, against whatever direction the arrangement seemed to face, felt worse than continuing. I don't know how to explain that reasoning in a way that sounds entirely rational. It's what I felt, so I walked through it. I kept my eyes forward and I walked at a pace that was faster than a hike and slower than a run, and I tried not to look too directly at the things hanging in my peripheral vision on both sides. I could hear them. Slightly the faint, dry percussion of bones touching bones when a branch shifted overhead, the soft movement of fabric. The smell was stronger in the middle of the stretch, thick enough to taste in the back of my throat. I counted my steps. I focused on the trail surface in front of my feet. I walked the half-mile in a state of controlled deliberateness that cost me more effort than any physical climb I'd done that day. When the trees thinned on the other side and the trail opened back out into ordinary forest, I stopped and let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. That's when I saw the woman. She was sitting on a fallen log about 15 feet off the right side of the trail, in the space between two large oaks. Elderly, genuinely elderly. The kind of age that's hard to estimate beyond a certain point. Small, dressed in dark layers that suited the cold, her hands resting in her lap with the relaxed stillness of someone who had been sitting quietly for a long time before I arrived. She was looking directly at me. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She didn't startle or shift when I came out of the tree corridor and nearly walked past her without seeing her. She simply sat and watched me with an expression that I have spent considerable time trying to characterize and have never quite managed. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't welcoming. It was the expression of someone watching something proceed according to expectations, a quality of observation that was entirely without surprise. I stopped walking. I nodded at her, the way you nod at anyone you encounter unexpectedly in the backcountry, the acknowledgement that passes for greeting when you don't know what else to offer. She didn't nod back. She didn't blink that I noticed. She just watched me with those calm, dark eyes and said nothing and did nothing. And after a moment that lasted much longer than it should have, I started walking again. I looked back twice. Both times she was still sitting there, still watching the trail, still completely motionless. The second time I looked back, she was far enough away that I couldn't read her expression anymore, just her shape against the pale trunks of the oaks, upright and still as something that had grown there. I covered the last 3 miles to the trailhead faster than I have ever covered any 3 miles on any trail in my life. Not running, I wouldn't let myself run, but moving at the edge of what can be called walking, my pack bouncing, my breathing ragged, my eyes checking the tree line on both sides at intervals I couldn't control. I reached the gravel shoulder in my car and got inside and sat there with the doors locked and the engine running, staring at the trail opening in the tree line. I've tried to research what I saw on that trail, the construction of it, the materials, the arrangement. I've read about Appalachian folk traditions and older mountain practices that predate the communities that eventually settled the ridge. I've found things that are adjacent to what I saw, practices involving bundled herbs and hanging objects that go back generations in mountain culture, protective and ritual in nature, rooted in beliefs that were old before the country was a country. I don't know exactly what tradition what I walk through belongs to, and I'm not sure the category matters. What I know is that an elderly woman was sitting at the far end of it, in the cold, alone, on a Tuesday in October, on a trail that doesn't appear in any current guide, watching the passage through something she had either made or tended or both. And when I passed through it, through her corridor, past her objects, under her hanging bones and herbs and shapes, she watched me go without a word, with the patience of someone who had watched many things pass through, and expected to watch many more. I have not gone back to that trail. I don't have any plans to go back. Some places, I've come to understand, are not maintained for visitors. Some things hanging in the trees are not meant to be walked past and forgotten. And some silences, when offered by someone sitting alone in the cold woods watching you with calm and patient eyes, are not an absence of communication. They're an answer to a question you didn't know you'd asked. The second day of a long solo section hike has a particular quality that I've never been able to fully describe to someone who hasn't done it. The first day is all logistics and adjustment, finding your pace, getting the weight of the pack settled into your body, working through the mental noise you carried in from the parking lot. By the second morning, that noise is gone. You've slept on the ground, you've eaten trail food, you've covered enough miles that your legs have remembered what they're for. The world outside the trail has receded to a place that feels genuinely distant, not just physically, but in some harder-to-name way, like a frequency you've tuned out. You stop thinking about what you left behind. You start thinking only about what's in front of you, the next water source, the next elevation change, the quality of light through the canopy, the sound the leaves make under your feet. It's the closest thing to pure presence I've ever found, and it's the reason I keep going back. I was 2 days into a 6-day section hike through a stretch of the Blue Ridge that I'd been planning for most of that summer. Not a heavily trafficked section far enough from the popular overlooks and parkway access points that the trail thinned out to the kind of quiet you only get on routes that require genuine commitment to reach. I'd passed a handful of other hikers on day one, exchanged the brief nods and trail pleasantries that long-distance hikers exchange, and then the trail had emptied out and stayed empty. By the morning of day 2, I had not seen another person in nearly 18 hours, which was exactly what I'd wanted. The morning was overcast and cool, the trail still damp from overnight condensation, the forest on both sides dense and dark, in the way that Blue Ridge forest gets dense in the deep sections, rhododendron and mountain laurel pressing in close, the canopy overhead thick enough to keep the light dim even at mid-morning. I was moving well, better than the day before, the pack sitting right on my hips, my breathing even, and controlled on the climbs. I had 12 miles planned for the day. I was thinking about water, about the creek crossing I expected around mile 7, about whether the clouds would clear by afternoon. I almost walked directly into him. He was sitting against a tree on the right side of the trail, back against the trunk, legs stretched out in front of him across the path, completely still. The trail curved just before him, and the rhododendron on both sides was thick enough that I didn't see him until I was 10 feet away and already committed to the step. I pulled up short, and my heart lurched in the way it does when the unexpected happens before your mind has time to classify it. Then I classified it, and the lurch didn't entirely go away. He was a man, somewhere in a middle range of age that was hard to pin more precisely because of the condition he was in. And the condition he was in was not good. His clothes, hiking clothes once, I thought, though it was hard to be sure, were filthy in a way that went beyond trail dirt. Filthy in the way of things that have been worn continuously through weather and exertion and sleep without ever being cleaned or changed. His jacket was torn at both shoulders, not the clean tiers of fabric catching on branches, but the ragged deterioration of material that had simply given out over time. His pants were similarly compromised. His boots, laced work boots, not trail shoes, were falling apart in a specific way. I've only seen on footwear that has been wet and dried and wet again too many times, the soles beginning to separate from the uppers along the edges, the leather cracked and stained beyond what any conditioner could have helped. He was thin, Not hiker thin, which is a specific kind of lean that comes from sustained physical effort and can actually look healthy. This was the thinness of someone who had not been eating enough for long enough, that their body had started reclaiming itself. The angles of his face too pronounced, the tendons in his hands too visible. He held himself with the unguarded looseness of someone who had stopped caring about posture, which told me something about how long he'd been sitting where he was. But his eyes were clear. That was the thing I noticed when he looked up at me, slowly, without alarm, without the disorientation you'd expect from someone in his physical state. His eyes were clear and focused and entirely present, and they looked at me with a quiet patience that didn't fit the rest of what I was seeing. I asked him if he was all right. It was a reflex, what you say when you come upon something that isn't obviously an emergency but clearly isn't normal. He looked at me for a moment before answering, in the unhurried way of someone who had stopped measuring time in the units most people use. He said he'd been out in the mountains for 3 weeks. I asked if he needed help. He said no. I asked if he was lost. He looked at me with what I can only describe as mild amusement at the question and said no, he wasn't lost. He said he just hadn't felt like leaving yet. I stood there on the trail looking at him, and he sat against his tree, looking back at me, and neither of us spoke for a moment. I was trying to reconcile what I was hearing with what I was seeing. What I was seeing was a man who was physically deteriorating, underfed, exposed, wearing gear that had passed well beyond its functional limits. What I was hearing was someone who was not in distress, not performing calm for my benefit. Actually, genuinely, settled. The way a person is settled when they are exactly where they want to be and have been there long enough that the wanting and the being have merged into something they don't need to think about anymore. I asked when he'd last eaten. He thought about it with the vagueness of someone for whom meals had become irregular enough to lose their anchoring function in a day. He said yesterday. Maybe. He said it without concern. I took off my pack and opened it, and pulled out what I could spare reasonably. Some bars, a bag of nuts, some dried fruit. I held it out to him. He accepted it without effusive gratitude, without the excessive thankfulness that people perform when they know they're supposed to feel grateful. He just took it and looked at it and set it beside him, like he was filing it for later consideration rather than responding to hunger. I asked him about resupply. He said he hadn't brought any. I asked about a map. He said he didn't have one. A phone? He shook his head once, slowly. Emergency beacon? The same slow shake. He had come into the mountains with what he was wearing and what he could carry, and he had been here for 3 weeks. And the mountains had apparently sustained him, in ways I couldn't fully account for by looking at him, because he was still here, still coherent, still looking at me with those clear and patient eyes. I crouched down to his level, because standing over someone on the ground while talking to them has always felt wrong to me. I asked him where he'd come in from. He named a trailhead I knew, a small access point about 40 miles south, well outside the section I was hiking. I asked if he'd covered the distance between there and here over 3 weeks, and he said more or less, with some doubling back. 40 miles in 3 weeks was slow enough that walking had barely been the point. He'd been inhabiting the trail rather than traveling it. He asked where I was headed, and I told him the general route. He nodded and said a few things about the trail ahead, specific things. He mentioned a section of washout past what he called the second rock face that would make the marked trail impassable, and described a reroute around it in enough detail that I could have followed it without seeing it first. He mentioned a spring about 2 miles past mile marker 11 that he said ran clean even in dry weather, not on any map I had, not in any trail notes I'd pulled before the hike. He described a particular overlook that he said most people missed because the spur trail to it wasn't blazed, and he gave me directions to it in terms of landmarks rather than distances, the way someone gives directions from memory rather than from a map. I asked how he knew all of this, and he said he'd been watching the trail. The phrase sat in the air between us in a way that phrases don't usually sit. I turned it over in my mind while he watched me do it. He didn't elaborate. He didn't seem to feel that it required elaboration. I asked what he meant by watching the trail, and he looked past me, back down the section I'd come from, and said that when you stayed in one place long enough, you started to understand the way things move through it. He said it quietly, without drama, in the same settled tone he'd used for everything else. Like it was simply a fact about long-term presence in a place that I hadn't gotten around to learning yet. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't, honestly. I thanked him for the information, which felt inadequate. I told him the trailhead I was heading toward was staffed most days, if he wanted to come out with me or follow behind at whatever pace worked for him. He smiled at that, a small, genuine smile, the first real expression I'd seen from him, and said he appreciated it, but he wasn't ready to come out yet. I said, okay. I stood up and put my pack back on, and I asked him one more time if he was sure he didn't need anything. He looked up at me with those clear eyes and said he was sure. So I nodded and I started walking. About 50 yards up the trail, I looked back. He was gone. Not gone in the sense that the trail had curved and taken him out of my sightline. I could see all the way back to the tree he'd been sitting against, and the trail was straight in between. The tree was there. The ground in front of it was there. He was not there. I had not heard him stand up. I had not heard footsteps, not heard the movement of brush, not heard the sound of a person in any state of physical deterioration getting up from the ground and moving off the trail. I had heard nothing, and in the 15 seconds it took me to cover 50 yards on a quiet trail in still air, he had simply ceased to be visible. I stood and looked at that empty space for a long time. I looked at the tree line on both sides. I looked at the rhododendron. Nothing moved. Nothing sounded. The trail behind me was as empty and silent as the trail ahead. I found the washout where he said it would be. I used the reroute he described, and it was exactly as he had said, clear, passable, obviously used. I found the spring past mile marker 11, unmarked on any map I had, running cold and clean. I found the overlook from his landmarks and stood there for 20 minutes, looking out at the mountains and thinking about a man who had been in them for 3 weeks, and had apparently decided they were more his home than wherever he'd come from. When I came out at the far trailhead 5 days later, I asked the ranger on duty about long-term hikers in that section. She checked her logs. She made a call. She came back and told me there was no record of anyone hiking that section for longer than 4 days that entire season. No permit applications for extended backcountry stays. No incident reports involving anyone matching the description I gave. 3 weeks in the mountains, off map, off grid, off record, watching the trail, learning the way things move through it. I've thought about him more times than I can count since then. Where he went after I walked away, whether he ever came out, whether he wanted to, whether the mountains that had taken him in so completely ever gave him back, or whether he simply became part of what moves through that section of trail, present and patient and clear-eyed, watching from somewhere just past the edge of where hikers think to look. Some goals take up residence in the back of your mind in a way that other goals don't. Most things I want to do, I want, and then I do them, or I don't, and either way the wanting eventually fades. But this summit had been different. I'd first read about it in a collection of regional trail writing, not a guidebook, more of a personal account by someone who had spent decades exploring the lesser-known peaks of the southern Blue Ridge, the ones that didn't make it into the mainstream literature because they lacked the dramatic elevation or the accessible trailheads that drew the crowds. This particular peak was described in a single paragraph, almost as an aside, with the kind of brief and unadorned language that serious backcountry people use when they're describing something they'd rather keep quiet, rarely visited. Unmaintained approach. Requires navigation. Good compass work essential. The view, when you get there, is worth every bit of the effort. That paragraph had stayed with me for 2 years. Not obsessively, I wasn't dreaming about it or building it into something larger than it was. It just sat there in the back of my mind, with the quiet persistence of unfinished things, surfacing occasionally when I was planning other trips and reminding me that it was still there, still waiting. I finally committed to it in early November of last year. The timing was deliberate. The southern Blue Ridge in early November is past the leaf-peeping crowds, past the shoulder season backpackers, past most of the people who come out for the color and the mild weather. By November, the casual visitors have gone home, and what's left is the trail at its most honest bare trees, cold air, short days, and the kind of solitude that you can only get when the weather has done the work of discouraging everyone who doesn't actually need to be out there. I spent 3 weeks preparing in the specific way that an unmaintained summit requires. I got the relevant topo maps, paper ones, the large format USGS sheets that show enough detail to navigate by in poor conditions, and I studied them until I could trace the route from the Forest Service Road to the summit in my head. I identified the key decision points, the places where the faint trail would likely become ambiguous and a compass bearing would be necessary to stay en route. I checked recent trip reports and found almost nothing, 2 posts from the past 3 years, both brief, both confirming the route was still passable but increasingly overgrown in the upper section. I made sure my compass was calibrated. My map case was waterproof. My layers were appropriate for temperatures that could drop to the 20s on the exposed summit. I drove up the night before and slept in my car at the Forest Service road pull-off, which put me at the trailhead at first light without the 2-hour drive in the dark. The morning was cold in the high 20s when I woke up, the windows of my car frosted on the inside from my own breath overnight. I ate in the car with the heater running, checked my pack, checked my map, and started up the trail as the sky was just beginning to lighten in the east. The lower section of the approach was straightforward, an old logging road, long decommissioned, that climbed steadily through second-growth forest for the first 2 miles. The road surface was still visible as a slightly cleared corridor through the trees, wide enough that navigation wasn't an issue. My breath made clouds in the cold air, and the frost on the leaf litter crunched softly under my boots, and the sky went from black to gray to a pale and diffuse white as the sun came up somewhere behind the overcast. It was a good morning, a quiet morning, the kind of morning that reminds you why you do this. The old road ended at a collapsed fence line around mile 2, and from there the actual trail, such as it was, began. Faint would be an understatement. In the summer, with the undergrowth fully leafed out, I suspect it would be nearly invisible. In November, with everything stripped back, I could make it out as a slight depression in the leaf litter, a subtle corridor between the trees that my eyes could follow if I paid attention. I took a compass bearing at the fence line, confirmed it against the topo, and started up. The upper section of any unmaintained approach has a specific quality of effort that maintained trails don't require. It's not just physical, it's cognitive. You're navigating constantly, checking the bearing, reading the terrain against the contour lines on the map, making small decisions every 100 feet about whether the route you're on still makes sense or whether you've drifted off and need to correct. It takes up a certain amount of mental bandwidth that a blazed trail leaves free, and the result is a kind of focused presence that I actually enjoy despite the difficulty. You can't drift, you have to stay with it. I reached the summit at 11:40 in the morning after 4.5 hours of hiking. The peak announced itself, the way small southern Blue Ridge summits often do, not with drama, not with a sudden opening, but gradually, the trees thinning and shortening, and the rock beginning to show through the thin soil until I was walking on exposed granite and could see the sky in all directions. The summit itself was a broad, flat shelf of rock maybe 30 feet across, oriented north to south, with a view to the west that opened across 3 ridges of folded mountain disappearing into the haze. The iron post was exactly where the description had placed it, driven into a crack in the rock near the western edge of the shelf, rusted to a deep orange-brown, leaning very slightly southward. It had been there long enough that the rock around its base had been stained by the rust runoff. I touched it when I reached it, the way you touch a summit marker acknowledgement, small ritual. The physical confirmation that you actually made it to the thing you came for. The weatherproof container was attached to the post with a wire loop, a small, flat plastic case of the kind sold for this exact purpose, army green, closed with a simple latch. I opened it and found inside a folded notebook, the kind with water-resistant pages, and a stub of pencil attached to the wire loop of the container by a short string. A trail register. I sat down on the rock with my back against the post and opened the notebook. It was maybe 2/3 full. The earliest entries near the front were dated 4 and 5 years back, and they were sparse. This summit didn't get many visitors, and the register reflected that. Most pages held only 1 or 2 entries. I read through them slowly, the way you read summit registers, with the specific pleasure of the record, the names, the dates, the brief observations that people leave when they've worked hard to get somewhere and want to mark the fact of having been there. Good views. Took 6 hours from the road. Worth it. Saw 2 peregrine falcons. Cold up here in October. Found this place by accident and will come back. I added my own entry near the back of the notebook, my name, the date, the time, a sentence about the quality of the morning. Then I closed the notebook and started to tuck it back into the container, and that's when the photograph fell out. It had been wedged between the last 2 pages of entries, flush with the notebook edge in a way that made it invisible until the notebook flexed. A printed photograph, the kind with a white border, the kind that comes from a pharmacy photo counter or a home printer, the kind that people produce when they want a physical image rather than a file on a phone. I picked it up. It was a picture of this summit. Unmistakably the same granite shelf, the same iron post, the same western view. Taken in what I could tell was late fall. Maybe a week or two past peaked the trees in the background bare, a flat gray sky, frost whitening the rock around the post's base. The light had the flat, cold quality of an overcast November day, similar to the light I was sitting in right now. Standing at the post was a figure in a dark jacket. I looked at them for a moment, with the casual attention you'd give to a stranger in a photograph, trying to gauge age or build from posture, the automatic assessment that people make. And then I noticed that they were not facing the camera. They were facing away from it, facing east, toward the trail that came up the backside of the summit shelf, toward the approach I had just climbed. Their face was not visible. Their attention, if you can assign attention to a figure in a photograph, was directed entirely toward the trail below, toward the eastern edge of the summit shelf, where the rock gave way to the trees, and the faint path disappeared downward. I looked at the trail in the background of the photograph. The trail was not empty. Far below, at the point where the trees began and the rock ended, visible in the background of the image, at a scale that made them small but not ambiguous, there was a second figure, on the trail, below the summit, looking up. The distance in the image was enough that no detail was visible, just the fact of presence, the unmistakable vertical shape of a person standing on a trail and looking toward the summit above them. I sat with the photograph in my hands on that cold granite shelf, and I looked at it for a long time. I looked at the figure at the post. I looked at the figure on the trail below. I looked at the relationship between them, the one above watching the approach, the one below looking up, watching and being watched, or watching and not yet knowing they were watched, which are two very different things with very different implications. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in pencil that had faded to the pale gray of old graphite, someone had written a date. I read it twice. I sat with it. The date was 2 weeks ago. I was alone on that mountain. I had been alone since leaving my car before dawn. I had seen no one on the approach, no other vehicles at the pull-off, no sign of recent passage on the faint trail above the old logging road. And yet someone had been on this summit 2 weeks ago and taken a photograph of a figure watching the trail and had placed it in the register between the last 2 pages, where it would only be found by someone who flexed the notebook while putting it away. I put the photograph back where I'd found it. I don't know why I think about that decision sometimes, and I'm not entirely sure what the reasoning was. Something about taking it felt wrong, in the same way that taking something from a place it was deliberately left feels wrong. It had been placed there. I left it placed. I repacked the register, latched the container, and started down. I descended faster than was safe for that terrain. I know that I knew it while I was doing it, felt the looseness of my footing on the frost-touched rock in the upper section, felt my pack throw my balance on the steeper pitches of the trail below. I didn't slow down. Something had happened to my relationship with that summit and the trail leading up to it, some rearrangement of how I understood the morning, and what I needed more than safety was distance. I did not look back, not once, from the moment I left the summit shelf to the moment I reached the old logging road, and the trees closed in enough that looking back would have shown me nothing but forest anyway. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead and I moved, and I did not let myself think about the figure facing the approach, or the figure on the trail below, or the date written in fading pencil on the back of a photograph placed in a register on a summit that almost no one visits. I reached my car at 3 in the afternoon with the light already failing. I sat inside with the doors locked and the heater running and looked at the Forest Service road stretching back toward the mountain I'd just come down from. I've thought many times about who took that photograph, about the figure at the post and whether they knew the person below them was there, about the person below whether they knew, in that moment caught in the image, that they were being watched from above, about who placed the photograph in the register and why and what they intended for whoever found it. I've thought about the date and about how many people, if any, summited that peak in the 2 weeks between when the photograph was taken and when I found it. I've thought about whether any of them found it before me, and what they did with it, and whether they felt what I felt sitting on that cold granite with the image in my hands. I've thought about whether the figure on the trail in the background of that photograph looks anything like me. I haven't let myself look closely enough to answer that. I have a particular relationship with trail folklore that I think is worth explaining before I get into what happened, because it's relevant to why I made the choices I made, and why I'm still not entirely sure what to do with what I found at mile marker 11. I don't dismiss trail stories. That's the first thing. I've been hiking long enough and talked to enough serious backcountry people to know that the stories which circulate among long-distance hikers, the ones passed from shelter to shelter, trailhead to trailhead, the ones that get told quietly around fires by people who are not given to exaggeration, are not the same as ghost stories told for entertainment. They're different in texture. They're told by people who are specific about details, who acknowledge what they don't know, who resist the pressure to make the ending more conclusive than the experience actually was. Those stories I take seriously, in the sense that I take the person telling them seriously and assume something real is at the center of whatever got embellished in the retelling. But I also don't let them govern my decisions. That's the second thing. I've hiked too many trails that had reputations for bad weather, for difficult navigation, for strange encounters, and found nothing more than a hard day in the mountains. Reputation and reality are different things. And if I avoided every trail that someone somewhere had said gave them an uneasy feeling, I'd have missed half the best hiking of my life. So when I first heard about the campsite at mile marker 11, I filed it in the category of trail folklore that I respected without being governed by. I'd heard about it from two separate people over the course of about 2 years, not in the same conversation, not on the same trail, which gave it more weight than if it had come from a single source. Both times the account was similar in its vagueness. The campsite was a logical overnight stop on a mid-length Blue Ridge route, well situated and frequently used, and people felt uneasy there. That was the consistent part. The uneasy part. Both people had difficulty being more specific than that. One said she'd packed up and left around 2 in the morning and couldn't tell me exactly why, beyond a feeling she wasn't able to name. The other said he'd stayed the full night but hadn't slept, and when I pressed him, he said the place felt watched in a way that the other campsites on that trail didn't. Neither of them claimed anything concrete had happened. Neither of them told me not to camp there. They just mentioned it the way hikers mention things as information, offered without prescription, to do with what I wanted. I planned to camp at mile marker 11 because it was the logical stopping point for the itinerary I'd built. The trail was a 2-day route, about 22 miles total, with the natural overnight somewhere in the middle, and mile marker 11 put me at the right mileage for an even split. There were other possible campsites in that section, but they required either cutting the first day short or extending it past comfortable, and I didn't want to reorganize my whole itinerary around the uneasy feeling that 2 people had experienced at a campsite I hadn't seen yet. That felt like the wrong way to make decisions. I started the trail on a Wednesday, which kept the crowd factor low. October, mid-month, overcast but dry. The first 11 miles were good hiking, varied terrain, decent views from 2 open ridgeline sections, a reliable water source at mile 8 where I refilled and filtered before the final push to camp. I reached mile marker 11 in the early evening, about 5:30, with enough light left to set up comfortably. The campsite was a good one, physically. I want to be clear about that, because I think it matters. There was nothing visually wrong with it, nothing that would have given you pause if you didn't know what people said about it. It was a flat, open area, about 40 feet across, set back from the trail by a short spur path, sheltered on the northern side by a low rocky outcrop, and ringed on the other 3 sides by mature hardwood forest. A fire ring, well used and well maintained. Several flat spots where previous campers had obviously set up tents, the ground worn smooth from use. A good campsite on a good trail. The kind of place that shows up as a green tent icon on the trail app and gets 3 stars from everyone who stays there. I set up my tent on the flattest of the worn spots, which put my door facing south, toward the trail spur and the main route beyond it. I cooked my dinner a proper camp meal, not just a bar, because I'd carried the extra weight specifically to have something real to eat at the end of the first day. I ate slowly, watching the light fade through the canopy, listening to the forest settle into its evening sounds. A woodpecker worked a dead tree somewhere to the east. Something small moved steadily through the leaves to my left, probably a mouse on its nightly circuit. The fire ring was there, but I didn't build a fire. I rarely do on solo overnight trips, preferring to keep the evening simple. I cleaned up my cook kit, hung my food bag from a branch on the far side of the clearing, and sat outside the tent with my headlamp and a book until the cold pushed me inside. I turned in at 8:30, which is early, even by trail standards, but 11 miles of hiking with a full pack earns an early night. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the forest and felt my legs begin the slow, deep ache that comes from the first serious day of a backpacking trip, and is somehow pleasant in the specific way that earned discomfort is pleasant. I was asleep within 20 minutes. I don't know what woke me, that's the honest answer. There was no sound that I can identify, no movement I felt through the ground, no specific stimulus I can point to. I was asleep, and then I was awake, completely and immediately awake, in the way that you are not when an alarm pulls you out of sleep, but in the way that you are when something has happened before your conscious mind is ready to process it. Alert, heart already moving faster than sleep pace, eyes open in the dark of the tent. The feeling was immediate and total. I was not alone. I want to be precise about this because I think the precision matters. It was not the vague, ambient unease of a strange place at night. It was not the low-grade anxiety of sleeping alone in the backcountry that beginners feel and experienced hikers learn to set aside. It was specific, directed, the feeling of a presence, the way you feel a presence in a dark room before you can see it, not a suspicion, not an inference, but a direct and certain perception, the same sense that tells you, without any supporting evidence, that you are being looked at. I have felt that feeling before in my life. I have never felt it as strongly as I felt it at mile marker 11 at midnight, lying in my sleeping bag, in a tent in the Blue Ridge. I lay still. I controlled my breathing. I listened with the specific quality of attention that you develop over years of solo camping. The ability to hear through ambient sound, to filter wind and leaf movement, and branch creak, and isolate anything underneath those sounds that doesn't belong. I listened for 60 seconds, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, tracking time by counting my own carefully regulated breaths. Nothing. No footsteps on the leaf litter. No sound of breathing or movement. No brush of fabric against vegetation. No creak of weight on a branch. None of the sounds a person makes when they are near a tent in the dark. Nothing. The absence of sound did not make the feeling go away. I want to be clear about that too. The feeling that I was not alone was not diminished by the silence. If anything, it was worse, the specific horror of certainty without evidence, of knowing a thing that you cannot support and cannot dismiss. I waited as long as I could make myself wait. Then I turned on my headlamp and unzipped the tent door in one motion. The campsite was empty. The beam of my headlamp swept the full perimeter, the tree line on all 3 forested sides, the rocky outcrop on the north, the spur trail back to the main route. Nothing, no one. Just the clearing and the trees, and the darkness beyond my beam's reach. Then I saw what had been done with my gear. Everything I'd left outside the tent, my boots, set beside the door when I'd gone to sleep. My pack, leaning against the tent's side. My trekking poles, collapsed and lying alongside the pack. All of it was gone from where I'd left it. I swung the beam across the clearing and found it on the far side, near the tree line, arranged in a row, not scattered, not thrown, not the disordered displacement of an animal investigating camp smells. Arranged. My boots side by side, toes pointing toward the trees. My pack centered between the boots and the poles, upright, as if set down carefully by someone who knew how to handle a loaded pack. My trekking poles flanking the pack on either side, parallel, equidistant. A row of my belongings, 15 feet from my tent door, oriented precisely toward the tree line, as if placed there by someone who wanted them facing a specific direction, or who wanted me to face that direction when I found them. I stood in the door of my tent in my socked feet and looked at my gear arranged on the far side of the clearing, and I looked at the tree line beyond it, and I looked at the darkness between the trunks, and I did not see anything looking back at me. I did not hear anything. The forest was quiet in the deep, complete way it gets in the middle of the night, and nothing moved, and nothing sounded, and my gear sat in its careful row in the beam of my headlamp, and I stood there in my tent door understanding fully, for the first time, why people left this campsite before morning. I broke camp in 35 minutes, which is faster than I have ever broken camp in my life. I packed methodically, because methodical was the only way I could keep my hands steady enough to be useful. Sleeping bag first, pad, tent body, poles, rain fly, stuffed sacks into pack in the order I'd practiced enough times to do in the dark. I put on my boots, I shouldered my pack, I clicked on my headlamp, and I walked out of that clearing down the spur trail to the main route, and I turned south toward the trailhead I'd come from, and I hiked by headlamp for 3 hours until I reached my car. I've talked to 4 other hikers since then who have camped at mile marker 11. I sought them out specifically through trail forums, through mutual connections in the long-distance hiking community, through the slow work of finding the people whose accounts I'd half remembered and tracking them down to ask the direct question. All 4 of them left before morning. 2 of them described the same thing. I found gear moved, arranged, placed with a deliberateness that ruled out animals and wind and the ordinary explanations. 1 of them described the same feeling of waking, the same certainty of presence, the same silence that refused to explain it. The 4th wouldn't tell me what had happened specifically. She just said she didn't go back, and the way she said it closed the subject. I've thought about what connects those accounts, what the consistent element is across 5 different people on 5 different nights spread across I don't know how many years. The moved gear, the feeling, the leaving before dawn, all of it converging on a clearing at mile marker 11 that looks, in the daylight, like a perfectly ordinary campsite on a perfectly ordinary trail. I don't have a conclusion. I've stopped looking for one. Some things in those mountains don't resolve into explanations, and spending too much effort trying to make them do so starts to feel like a mistake, like pushing on a door that was left closed for a reason. What I have instead is the memory of standing in my tent door at 1 in the morning looking at my belongings arranged in a row in the beam of my headlamp, and the absolute, unshakable certainty, still present now years later, that I was not alone in that clearing. Whatever was there with me, it never made a sound. It never let me see it. It just moved my things and pointed them toward the trees, and waited to see what I would do. I left. I think that was the right answer. I think leaving, quickly and without looking back, is the right answer to a great many things in those mountains that you don't fully understand. Some questions are better carried home unanswered than pressed to their conclusion in the dark. I've been doing early starts on trail for so long that it doesn't feel like a choice anymore, it's just how I hike. The alarm goes off at 3:30, and I'm already half awake, already running through the checklist in my head before my feet hit the floor. Boots laced by 3:50, car keys, headlamp, packed by the door the night before. Driving the approach road in the dark, with the windows down because cold air keeps me sharper than coffee on those early miles of blacktop before the trailhead. There's a version of the world that exists between 3 and 5 in the morning that most people never see, and after years of early starts, I've come to feel something close to ownership of it, not literally. Not in any way I'd try to explain to someone who sleeps until 7, but in the way that regular presence in a place creates a kind of intimacy with it. Those hours belong to me in a way that felt earned. I want to say that up front because it's relevant to why what happened unsettled me as deeply as it did. This was not my first dark start. This was not my first solo pre-dawn hike, or my first time moving through Blue Ridge Forest by headlamp before the rest of the world was awake. I was not jumpy or inexperienced, or prone to frightening myself with shadows and sounds. I knew that environment. I was comfortable in it, in the specific, practiced way that comes from having repeated an experience enough times that it stops being foreign. Which means that when something was wrong, I knew it was wrong, and I can't explain it away as the nerves of someone unfamiliar with the dark. The trail I was on that morning was a moderate out and back in the central Blue Ridge, about 14 miles round trip, with a long ridgeline section in the middle that I'd been wanting to catch at sunrise for 2 seasons. The timing required an early start to hit the ridge at first light, which put me at the trailhead at 4 in the morning, in the full dark of a late October night, with a headlamp and a temperature in the upper 30s, and the trail entirely to myself in the way I preferred it. The first 40 minutes were exactly right. The headlamp threw a clean cone of light on the trail surface ahead of me, enough to read the ground and avoid roots and rocks, the darkness pressing in comfortably on both sides. The forest at that hour has a quality of stillness, that's different from the stillness of any other time, heavier, more absolute, as if the trees themselves have gone somewhere overnight and left only their shapes behind. My footsteps on the frost-stiffened leaves were the only sound. My breath made small clouds at the edge of my beam. I was moving well, warm from the exertion despite the cold, and the trail was familiar enough under my feet that I could let my mind go quiet and just move. I came around a long curve in the trail, and my headlamp beam reached out ahead of me and caught her. She was maybe 30 yards up the trail, moving away from me at a steady walking pace. A woman. I registered that immediately, from the build and the posture. Moving steadily, confidently, navigating the uneven trail surface with the ease of someone who had done it many times. And she had no light. No headlamp, no handheld flashlight, no phone screen, nothing. She was moving through the complete darkness of that trail at 4 in the morning in late October without any illumination whatsoever. I slowed my pace and watched her for a moment before I did anything else. She didn't react to my headlamp beam, which by then was almost certainly reaching her. She didn't turn around, didn't shield her eyes, didn't acknowledge the light at her back in any way. She just kept moving at that same even pace, following the curve of the trail with a certainty that didn't require being able to see it. I've met hikers who don't use headlamps in the dark. It's uncommon but not unheard of, people with exceptional night vision, or people who have hiked a particular trail so many times that they've essentially memorized it and can navigate by feel and memory on nights with enough ambient light. I've done it myself, on familiar trails under a full moon. I filed her under that category and kept walking, and within a few minutes, I'd closed the distance enough that it felt strange not to say something. I said good morning. She turned her head toward me without breaking stride and said good morning back, and in the wash of my headlamp beam, I got my first real look at her. Young mid-20s was my impression, though I was working from a brief sideways glimpse. Dressed in what struck me immediately as too light for the temperature, a thin long-sleeve base layer, lightweight pants, trail runners without gaiters, no jacket that I could see, no pack, just a small belt pouch, the kind of layering you'd choose for a summer morning, not late October in the upper 30s. I registered that and set it aside in the same folder as the no headlamp observation. Strange, but not impossible. Maybe she ran hot. Maybe she was moving fast enough to stay warm. Her voice when she'd said good morning was unhurried and clear, not the slightly thickened voice of someone recently awakened or insufficiently caffeinated at 4 in the morning. Alert, easy, as if the pre-dawn dark and the cold and the empty trail were all entirely routine conditions that required no adjustment or acknowledgement. We fell into step alongside each other on a wide section of trail, and I did the small talk that hikers do. Where are you headed? How's the trail been? The usual exchange. She answered in short, pleasant sentences without asking anything in return. Conversational but not engaged. The way people sound when they're being polite but don't particularly need the conversation. I asked if she'd started at the main trailhead, down at the road where I'd parked. She said yes. I asked what time she'd set out. She said about an hour ago, give or take. I did the arithmetic while keeping my pace steady, because I didn't want her to see me do it. An hour ago, from 4 in the morning, put her on the trail at approximately 3. Alone, no light, on a trail that required a 4-wheel drive Forest Service road approach and offered no ambient light from roads or structures anywhere on the route. At 3 in the morning in late October, I walked alongside her and kept my face neutral and turned that arithmetic over in my mind and tried to find the configuration of it that made comfortable sense. I couldn't find one. I asked if she did this often, early starts like this. I kept my voice casual, conversational, the tone of one hiker making small talk with another. She said she preferred the trail before people arrived. She said it simply, without any self-consciousness about how it might sound, the way you state a preference that has never required defending. She preferred it before people arrived, so she came before people arrived. Simple. I said something non-committal about early mornings being peaceful. She agreed, in that same pleasant, brief way, and we walked in silence for a minute or two. The trail narrowed and I dropped back half a step behind her, and in the beam of my headlamp, I watched her navigate a rough, rocky section of trail, the kind of section where, even with a headlamp, you had to watch your footing, where the uneven surface required visual confirmation before committing weight. She moved through it without hesitation, without any adjustment in her pace, placing her feet with a precision that would have been impressive in daylight and was something else entirely in the dark. Then she said the thing that I have not been able to put down since. She said it quietly, not as part of the conversation exactly, more as an observation addressed to the trail ahead of her rather than to me. Most mornings, she said, she had it completely to herself. 6 words, said softly, without particular emphasis, the way you'd mention a fact about your neighborhood or your commute. And somewhere in the saying of them, I realized something that I had been almost noticing for the past several minutes without fully assembling. She had not looked at me. Not once. Not when she'd turned her head at my greeting. Not during any part of our conversation. Not during the rocky section where she'd moved past me. She had been adjacent to me for almost 10 minutes, hiking and talking, and she had not once directed her eyes at me. Not a glance. Not a quick check of who was beside her. Not the normal visual acknowledgement that people perform constantly in conversation without thinking about it. She had looked at the trail. She had looked ahead. She had not looked at me. I don't know how to explain precisely why that was the thing that moved me from unsettled to something more urgent. The no headlamp could be explained. The light clothing could be explained. The 3 in the morning start could be explained, barely, with enough imaginative effort. But the not looking sat differently. It was too consistent to be accidental. 10 minutes of close proximity and conversation without a single direct glance is not inattention. It's a pattern, and patterns mean something. Patterns are the evidence of something organizing behavior from underneath. There was a trail junction coming up. I knew it from my map, a spur that cut east toward a viewpoint I'd planned to skip in favor of the ridge. I had no real reason to take it. But when I reached the junction marker, I stopped and said I was going to take the spur for a bit, the way you'd tell a hiking companion you were splitting off. A normal, casual, unexplained parting. She said okay. She said it without stopping, without turning, without any break in her pace. She just kept walking up the main trail, her shape passing quickly beyond the reach of my headlamp beam, and within a few seconds I couldn't hear her footsteps anymore. I sat on a rock at the junction with my headlamp off and I listened. No footsteps on the trail ahead, no sound of movement. The forest absorbed her in the same complete way it absorbs everything at 4 in the morning, without trace, without echo, without the residue of passage, as if she hadn't been there at all, or as if the trail ahead had simply taken her in. I sat there for 20 minutes. I turned my headlamp back on twice to check the main trail in both directions. Nothing. I waited until the waiting felt more frightening than moving, and then I got up and continued up the main trail and tried to understand what I was walking back into. I reached the ridge at first light, as planned. I stayed there for an hour, watching the sun come up over the eastern mountains, and I did not see her. I hiked the full return route and did not see her. I reached the trailhead parking area at 10 in the morning, and there were 4 other vehicles there that hadn't been there when I'd arrived in the dark. None of them had been there at 3 in the morning, when she would have parked. The gravel shoulder showed fresh tire tracks from the morning arrivals. I looked for tracks that might be older, from a vehicle that had come and gone in the pre-dawn hours. I couldn't read it clearly enough to be certain. I've thought about her more times than I can account for. About who hikes alone in the dark at 3 in the morning on a trail, with no ambient light, with no headlamp, in October, in light clothing, and does it with the ease and confidence of someone for whom those conditions are not exceptional but simply ordinary. About what she meant when she said most mornings she had it completely to herself, and whether the emphasis I keep hearing in that sentence in retrospect was something I added or something that was there. About what she was looking at the whole time we walked together, if she wasn't looking at me. I still do early starts. I want to be honest about that. I still get up before 4, still drive the dark approach roads, still clip on my headlamp and head into the pre-dawn forest because it's mine and I love it and I'm not willing to surrender it. But I don't do dark starts alone anymore on trails I don't know completely. And when I'm in the dark on a familiar trail and my headlamp beam reaches out ahead of me into the black, I no longer feel that uncomplicated sense of ownership I used to feel. I share those hours now with the awareness that the pre-dawn trail is not as empty as it looks. That other things, or other people, move through it before the world wakes up. That whatever is out there in the dark before first light, it doesn't always need a headlamp to find its way. And it doesn't always need to look at you to know you're there. There is a specific kind of knowledge that comes from years of solo hiking that I don't think translates well to people who haven't done it. I don't mean navigation or gear selection or the practical skills, though those matter too. I mean the knowledge of sound. The auditory literacy of wild places, the ability to hear something and place it correctly without having to think about it, the way a musician hears a note and knows immediately what it is and where it sits. You develop it slowly, over hundreds of days in the field, and at a certain point it stops being a skill you apply and becomes something closer to instinct. The mountain speaks a language, and you learn it. And once you've learned it, you don't unlearn it. I want to establish that because what I heard on that ridgeline trail in September is something I have been questioned about, gently, by people who weren't there. Wind, they say. Pareidolia of sound. The brain finding patterns in noise, the way it finds faces in clouds. You were tired. You were alone. The mind plays tricks. I understand why people say those things, and I don't hold it against them. But I've been hiking alone for most of my adult life, and I know what wind sounds like moving through a gap in the ridge, and I know what branches sound like settling against each other in the cooling air of a late afternoon, and I know what I heard, and what I heard was my name. The hike that day was a ridgeline route in the southern Blue Ridge that I'd been on twice before, a long out and back that gained most of its elevation in the first 3 miles and then ran along the spine of the ridge for another 4 before the descent back to the trailhead. 14 miles total, serious, but not extreme. The kind of day hike that requires an early start and a good pace to finish in daylight. I'd left the trailhead at 6:15 in the morning, signed the register at the trail box the way I always do, and started up in the cool gray of early September dawn. The ascent and the ridgeline were straightforward and good. The weather was ideal clear, mid-60s on the ridge. A light wind from the northwest that kept the temperature comfortable even in the open exposed sections. I saw 2 other hikers on the way up, both heading down as I was heading up, both the brief nod and continue type of encounter that makes up most of the human interaction on a long trail day. After them, the trail was empty in both directions, for as far as I could see. I reached the turnaround point, a rocky overlook at the trail's northern terminus, where the path simply ended at a cliff edge above a long valley at 11:40 in the morning. I ate lunch there, sat for 20 minutes watching a hawk work the thermals above the valley, and then turned around and started south, back the way I'd come. The descent was ahead of me, 7 miles back to the car, the bulk of it in the long downhill section that made up the final 4 miles of the route. I was moving well on the descent. I always move well going downhill. It's the direction my body prefers after a long day. Gravity doing some of the work, the trail familiar underfoot from the morning's ascent. My mind was in that loose, half-empty state that long days of solo hiking produce, not thinking about anything in particular, just receiving the trail as it came. The light was starting its long September lean toward afternoon, the shadows lengthening on the eastern side of the ridge, the air beginning its almost imperceptible cooling that preceded the real cold that would come after sundown. I had plenty of time to reach the car before dark. Everything was fine. I was in the middle section of the descent, past the technical rocky part near the top. Not yet to the hollow where the trail entered the trees, for the final run to the trailhead when I heard it. My name. I have tried to write that sentence in ways that do justice to the specificity of what I heard, and I keep failing, because the specificity is the entire point. This was not a sound that resembled my name, not an approximation that my tired brain assembled into familiar syllables from raw noise. It was my name, spoken clearly, at a normal conversational volume, not raised, not projected. The volume of someone talking to you at a table, not across a room. 2 syllables, the way my name has 2 syllables, with the natural stress pattern those syllables carry. Coming from below me on the trail, from the direction I was descending toward, from somewhere ahead and downhill, in a part of the trail I hadn't reached yet. I stopped walking immediately. My body stopped before my mind gave the instruction, the reflex stop of something heard that doesn't fit, that crosses a threshold between registered and alarming faster than conscious thought can process it. I stood on the trail and I listened and I called out. I used the standard response, "Hello, is someone there?" Called out at full volume in both directions, down the slope and back up toward the ridge. The kind of call that carries, the kind that would get an answer from anyone within reasonable distance who had a reason to be there and a reason to have said my name. Silence. Not the tense silence of something present and quiet. Not the silence I've described in other situations that felt occupied. Just the ordinary silence of a ridge trail in the afternoon. The distant traffic of birds. The wind in the upper canopy. The neutral ambient sound of a place going about its business, without reference to me. Nothing that suggested a source for what I'd heard. Nothing that suggested anyone within earshot. I stood there for 5 full minutes. I timed it, which is something I do when I'm trying to be rigorous about my own reactions. I checked my watch when I stopped and I didn't move until 5 minutes had passed. Because 5 minutes is long enough that anything present and stationary would have either revealed itself or made a mistake. Nothing. After 5 minutes, I took a breath and I started walking again. I tried to process it as I moved. I ran through the catalog of sounds I knew and tested each one against what I'd heard. Wind through rock features can produce vowel-like tones in certain conditions. But what I'd heard had consonants, the hard opening of my name's first syllable, the specific shape of the second. I knew what wind sounded like, and wind didn't do that. Animals can produce uncanny sounds. Foxes are the famous example. Their calls capable of raising hair on the neck of anyone who's heard one in the dark. But I knew fox sounds and I knew bird mimicry and I knew the repertoire of everything that lived on that ridge, and none of it produced a clean 2-syllable human name at conversational volume. I turned each possibility over and set each one down and kept walking. A quarter mile further down the trail, I heard it again. Same volume, same clarity, same 2 syllables with the same stress pattern and the same tonal quality. Not identical in the way a recording is identical, but recognizably the same voice, the same word, the same source. Still ahead of me, still below me on the descent, still coming from the part of the trail I was walking toward. Close enough that if a person had said it, I would have been able to see that person on this open section of ridge. There was no person on this section of ridge. I stopped again. I stood very still, and I did not call out this time, and I did not wait 5 minutes. I reached into the outer pocket of my pack, and I took out my knife, and I opened it, and I held it in my right hand with my thumb along the spine the way I'd been taught, and I stood there on the trail with the September sun throwing my shadow long to the east, and I waited for something else to happen. Nothing happened. The trail below me was visible for several hundred yards before it curved around the slope and disappeared into the first of the trees. Empty. The hillside on both sides of the trail was open enough that nothing larger than a bird could have moved in it without being visible. Empty. Whatever had said my name twice from below me on that trail was not present in any part of the landscape that I could see. I stood there for a long time. Longer than 5 minutes this time. Longer than was strictly rational, because I was not going to move until I had made my peace with moving, until I had decided that going forward toward the place where that sound had come from was something I was prepared to do. I am not someone who turns back from things easily. I've made that choice before on trails, in weather, in situations where the rational decision was to reverse course, and I've never made it lightly, and I've never made it because of a feeling. I made it here. I stood on that trail, and I genuinely considered turning around, covering the 7 miles back to the far terminus, sleeping in the open on the ridge if I had to, rather than descending toward whatever had spoken from below. In the end, I didn't turn back, and the honest reason is that going back seemed no safer than going forward. Turning around meant 7 miles of terrain between me and any other human being, the same terrain I'd been alone in all day, with the same unknown source somewhere on the mountain. Going forward meant 2 miles to the trailhead and my car. 2 miles was better than 7. I tightened my grip on the knife and I started down. The next 2 miles were the most concentrated attention I have ever paid to a trail in my life. Every curve before I took it, I stopped and listened. Every section of dense brush alongside the path, I watched before I passed it. I moved slowly, much more slowly than my pace of the day, stopping every few minutes to stand in full silence and account for everything I could hear. I heard nothing wrong. I heard nothing out of place. The trail went on being an ordinary trail, and the mountain went on making its ordinary sounds, and I heard my name 0 more times in the 2 miles between that second occurrence and the trailhead. I came out of the trees into the small parking area at 4:50 in the afternoon, with an hour of usable light still in the sky. My car was the only vehicle there. I checked the register on the way past the trailhead box, the way I always check the register on the way out, more out of habit than intention. I opened the notebook and went to the most recent entries and found my own signature from the morning. The entry before mine was 4 days old. A couple, from their names, who had done the same route and noted good weather and a bear sighting near mile 4. Before them, another gap of several days. The register told me what I'd effectively known since the parking area. I had been the only person on that trail all day. No day hikers who'd started after me and skipped signing in. No trail runners coming through fast. No one. I have gone over what I know, which is limited, and what I can reasonably conclude, which is more limited still. My name was spoken twice on that trail, from below me, at a volume and clarity that my 15+ years of solo hiking tell me was not producible by wind or animal or the ordinary acoustics of a ridge. There was no person on the trail. There was no record of any person having been on that trail. I have no explanation that I find adequate, and I have tried to find one with considerable effort over the time since it happened. What I have instead is the memory of stopping on that open September ridgeline with my knife in my hand and the trail below me empty, and the sound of my own name still sitting in my ears, like something placed there carefully, with intent, by whatever understood that it was the right thing to say to make me stop. I still hike that ridge. I've been back twice since then, but I don't move as freely on the descent as I used to, and I stop more than I should to listen to the trail below, and I have never once, in either of those subsequent visits, come close to recovering the ease I felt on that route before September. Some sounds, once heard in the wrong place, change the meaning of the silence that surrounds them. That trail is still a good trail, but it is not mine the way it was before. Something else knows my name on it, and that knowledge sits in me like a stone I can't set down. I've made bad calls in the backcountry before, and I expect I'll make them again. That's not fatalism, it's just honesty about what solo hiking in remote terrain actually involves over a long enough timeline. You misread weather. You push miles when you should make camp. You take a route that looks reasonable on the map and turns out to be something different on the ground. You make the call that seems right with the information you have, and sometimes the information you have is incomplete, and you end up somewhere you didn't plan to be, doing something you didn't plan to do. That's the nature of it. You learn from the bad calls, and you carry them forward as data, and you try to make better ones next time. The night I spent in the stone shelter on the northern Blue Ridge Trail is a bad call I think about differently than the others. Not because of what I did, my decision that night was reasonable given what I knew at the time, and I'd probably make the same call again with the same information. I think about it differently because of what I found when I got there. Because of what was written on those walls, and what I spent 3 hours understanding I didn't understand before I packed up in the rain and hiked out in the dark. The hike was a 3-day loop in a section of northern Blue Ridge that I'd done once before, 4 years earlier, going the opposite direction. I knew the general terrain the first day's climb, the long exposed ridgeline on day 2, the gradual descent through mixed forest on the 3rd. What I didn't know as well was the specific route in that direction, the way landmarks come at you differently when you're covering ground in reverse. I'd done my preparation, but the familiarity I had with the trail was the partial, imprecise familiarity of a route traveled once from the other end, which is a different thing from actually knowing it. The first 2 days were good. I won't linger on them because they're not the point, but I want you to know the context. 2 solid days of hiking. Nothing wrong, nothing unusual, the trail performing exactly as expected. I was moving well, sleeping well, feeling the particular competence that comes from being several days into a backcountry trip and fully adjusted to the rhythm of it. By the afternoon of day 2, I was on schedule and comfortable and entirely unsuspecting. The weather had been building since mid-afternoon. I'd watched it come in from the northwest, the way weather comes in on that section of ridge. The clouds thickening from white to gray to the particular flat, uniform gray that means business. The wind shifting and picking up, the temperature dropping faster than the hour alone could account for. I'd checked the forecast before I'd left, and there had been a system moving through the region that I'd expected to pass north of my route. It didn't pass north of my route. By 4:30 the sky was the color of old iron, and by 5 o'clock the rain had started in earnest, the heavy driven kind that a Blue Ridge storm delivers when it's serious. Not a passing shower, but a sustained event, with wind behind it that makes exposed camping a genuinely unpleasant and potentially problematic proposition. I was looking for my planned campsite, a flat area near a spring shown on my map, when I found the shelter. It was just off the main trail, visible through the trees in the way that a structure of that size is visible, even in heavy rain and failing light, a solidity, a geometric regularity among the organic randomness of the forest. A short path, not maintained, led from the main trail to a hollow in the hillside where the structure sat with its back wall against the slope, partially sheltered by the rock above and the mature trees around it. 3 walls and a partial roof of flat stone slabs, fitted together in the dry stack style of old mountain construction. No mortar, no signage, no indication of trail service origin or maintenance. It was simply there, older looking than anything I'd seen on that trail system, set into the hollow with the permanent quality of something that had grown from the hillside rather than been placed against it. I checked my map. Nothing. The hollow wasn't marked, the structure wasn't marked, there was no indication on any of my reference materials that anything was located at those coordinates. I checked my phone's offline map. Same result. The shelter that I was standing in front of, in the rain, did not appear to exist according to any documentation I had with me. The rain made the decision practical before I'd finished making it mentally. I ducked inside. The interior was small, maybe 8 feet wide, 6 feet deep, the back wall solid against the hillside, the 2 side walls running forward to open ends that the partial roof barely covered, dry toward the back, which was what mattered. The floor was earth, packed hard from decades of use, overlaid near the back wall with a scattering of old leaves that had blown in. It smelled of stone and cold and something faintly vegetative, not unpleasant, just old. The smell of a place that had been standing long enough to develop its own specific atmosphere, the way very old buildings do. I set up my sleeping pad against the back wall and laid my bag on it and hung my wet jacket from a protrusion in the side wall and sat down and watched the rain come in sideways past the open front of the shelter and felt the relief that any warm, dry space produces when you've been cold and wet for an hour. The light was going fast outside. I ate a cold dinner because I didn't want to risk a stove inside the enclosed space, and I read by headlamp for a while, and the storm continued its business without any particular concern for mine. It was around 9 o'clock, the storm still going strong outside, when I turned my headlamp toward the walls. I don't know what prompted it. Boredom, maybe, or the habitual curiosity of someone who notices their environment. The walls were stone, the same dry-stacked construction as the exterior, rough-faced, irregular in the way of hand-selected rock rather than quarried material. I'd been sitting with my back against the rear wall for hours without paying it specific attention. When I turned the headlamp toward the side wall to my left, I saw the carvings immediately and clearly, the raking light of my headlamp beam picking them out, the way raking light always does on carved stone. Names, carved into the stone in letters ranging from careful and precise to rough and urgent, in a variety of depths and tools and hands. Hikers carve their names in shelters. This is not unusual. It's practically a tradition on long-distance routes, the primitive impulse to mark presence, to say I was here, to leave some evidence of passage in a place that might remember it. I've seen it hundreds of times. I didn't think anything of it for the first few seconds. Then I started reading them, and I noticed what was wrong. No dates. Every shelter carving I'd ever seen was paired with something, a date, a hometown, a trail name, a companion's name alongside, some context that placed the carver in time and space and relationship. These had none of that. Each name stood alone, carved with varying degrees of care, in isolation, and beside each name, at a consistent height to the right of the letters, positioned with enough regularity to suggest intent, was a single horizontal line, not a dash, not punctuation, a mark. The kind of mark you make in a series when you're counting, when you reach one and stop because one is all there is to mark. I moved the headlamp slowly along the wall, name after name after name, each with its single mark. Some of the names were common first names I recognized, surnames I recognized. Some were unusual, older sounding, the kind of names that were common in a different era of mountain communities. Some were clearly old, the letters softened by time and the growth of thin mineral deposits in the cuts. Some looked recent, the edges of the carved letters still sharp. I lit my second headlamp, the backup I always carry, and used both to work my way along the wall more carefully, counting 43 names on the left wall. I moved to the right wall and counted those too. 31 more. I looked at the back wall, the one I'd had my back against all evening, and found it covered as well another 30, at least. The carvings denser here, overlapping in places where space had run short. More than 100 names in total, covering 3 walls of a shelter that didn't exist on any map, each name marked with a single tally line, in a hollow in the northern Blue Ridge that I had found by accident in a storm. I sat in the center of that shelter with both headlamps on and looked at the walls and thought about what the tally marks meant. A tally of 1 is the same as no tally at all. Practically speaking, you don't keep count of single things. You keep count when there are multiples. A tally of 1 beside a name is not a count. It's something else. It's a mark made beside a name for a reason that has nothing to do with counting. And I sat in that shelter for a long time, turning over the possibilities for what that reason was, and none of the possibilities I arrived at were ones I wanted to stay the night in proximity to. I packed in the rain. I did it efficiently and without panic, the way I pack when conditions require it, systematically, in order. Nothing rushed enough to make mistakes. I put on my wet jacket. I shouldered my pack. I stood at the open front of the shelter and looked out at the rain and the dark and the 2 miles of trail between me and my car, which I'd reached early and parked at an alternate trailhead that morning. 2 miles in the dark and heavy rain is not a good situation. It was a better situation than the alternative I'd been considering, which was staying. I hiked out by headlamp with the rain coming in hard at an angle, and the trail running with water in the low sections and my boots soaked through before the first half mile. I moved as fast as the footing and the dark allowed. I reached the trailhead at 11:40 at night and got in my car and sat there with the heater running for a long time before I drove. In the weeks after I got home, I tried to find any record of that shelter. I contacted the Park Service office responsible for that section of trail. I went through historical maps of the region, the older USGS surveys, and the even older county plat maps that predated the park boundaries. I reached out through hiking forums to people who'd done that loop and asked if they'd seen it. I found nothing. No historical shelter at those coordinates on any document I could access. No one in the forums who reported seeing it, though 2 people responded to say they'd heard something about a stone structure in that section from others and had never been able to find it themselves. I've thought many times about those names on the walls and the marks beside them, about what gets recorded in a place like that, in a shelter that predates the trail system around it, that doesn't appear on maps, that sits in a hollow off the main path waiting for storms to push people into it, about who made those marks and what they meant to mark, and whether the thing they were marking was a coming or a going, or simply a having been there, a record of presence in the same primitive tradition as any trail carving, or something with a different and more specific purpose that I passed a night inside without understanding. I don't know. I've accepted that I don't know, and that I'm unlikely to find out. What I carry from that night is not an explanation, but a set of images that won't leave me the raking light on carved stone, name after name after name, each one attended by its single patient mark. The rain outside, the smell of old stone and cold, and the particular quality of stillness that a place has when it has been holding something for a very long time and is entirely accustomed to the waiting.